this is kind of a great moment for we three up here and Sally Anderson and all the people involved in this We project, which is the coolest book ever written, in my humble opinion, about how to make a somewhat dicey situation in a country into the best, fastest growing economy in Europe. And this gentleman, Bill Harris, did that. And pretty amazing job. I mean, it's easy to talk, you know, it's hard to do the walk. And Pete and he wrote this book, which you all have, so we're not going to sell it to you. How to Change the Future, Lessons from Ireland on Revolutionizing Scientific Innovation and Economic Prosperity. And just for the heck of it, Bertie Ahern, who's probably the most famous politician in Irish history, wrote the foreword to it. You should read it. And if you know anybody in economic development circles, the higher up, the better. This is actually like a recipe book. It's not like my great life's memoirs book. It really tells you the how to do what they did. And it's fascinating from that perspective. Many of you have had consults where a country hired you or a city hired you to use technology to bring them Silicon Valley. And the graveyard is wide and deep, of those projects that didn't work. So the fact that Bill was able to do this is truly amazing. And reading about how he did it is not just inspirational, it's educational. Like any good how-to book, you really will understand what you came in knowing ahead of time somehow, I think, about how to be inclusive in a way which actually works, not just to sound good, but really works, and that you recruit interest and engagement from people who may not be totally used to that, and achieve things in a probably collegial way, since I know you, but somehow very effectively at the same time. So glad to be with both of you. I want to congratulate you on the launch of this book. I will mention to all of you that there are 2 launches of this book. Of course, the other one's going to be in Ireland. So we're going to fly over together pretty soon and do a Dublin launch of the book with Bertie Ahern and other people. And I am just really proud to be part of that story and that project. For those of you who are tracking SNS and FIRE books, this is a briefing book, we call it, which means we can get it out pretty fast. And it is what I just said it is. So we have now gotten a book out on China's national business model, on Japan's national business model, on Ireland's national business model. So if we're not careful, we'll be consistent. And this is good because I think this is a new kind of study. We came up with the idea, probably back when you were doing the work, that countries should not be called ism. That's not a communist or a capitalist. It's a business model just like IBM. Yeah. And if you want to understand what they're going to do next and why, you study that part of them instead of studying, I hate communists or I hate capitalists, well, all that crap. So to throw the politics away and understand how the money's being made and spent, and you'll have a really deep understanding of what's going to happen next. So I'm really happy to have this book in our new portfolio of how countries act like companies. My guess is we'll probably have India next, but it's, you guys, I hope, are in really good company here in terms of the book. So, Bill, I'd like to kind of start with you. I had an obvious question, and it's so obvious I'm embarrassed, but when you got the call, is it Mary? Who called you? Okay. You were in North Carolina?
South Carolina.
South Carolina. Oops. And totally different. And I want to know, why did she call you? How did she know you were the guy to call? Because you were the guy to call.
Well, she would probably say her own story of how she did it, but Ireland had a major search going on. They had a technology foresight study that went on in advance, where the business community, the academic community, and the government were talking about what they needed to do because their Celtic Tiger model was running out. And they talked to a number of people in the US to get advice. Mary had a particular interest in the National Science Foundation. She thought that was a good model. She looked at Australia, she looked at Europe, but she thought NSF was a good model. And they called around a few presidents of universities who had maybe an Irish connection. My name popped up a few times because I had been at NSF. And they had me as an advisor for about 6 months. Then I got the call, she wanted to meet me for breakfast in Washington.
Yep.
And I didn't know what the Taunista was. That was a new word to me.
So by the way, Mary Harney, the Taunista, I'm still having.
Yeah.
She was the deputy
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I knew what the word deputy prime minister meant. I knew what the word prime minister meant, but I didn't speak Gaelic. I wasn't used to that tongue, even though I have an Irish background with my grandparents. They did not speak Gaelic when they came over. They wanted their kids to speak English. So the Irish government officials asked me to meet with the Taunista for breakfast in D.C. And I had to look up what Taunista was. I didn't want to ask him that. She turned out to be a terrific leader and become a terrific friend over the years. And I was having breakfast with her, and she said something that was very simple. She said, we've made a decision. We'd like to have you become a candidate for this position. We have 2 terrific deans of engineering from Imperial and in Australia, but our selection committee and group prefers you. And I said, I think you ought to really get somebody from Ireland who knows the country better than I do. And she says, no, we want to get somebody from outside the country who will make sure they tell us what we really need to do and not just keep things as they are. We know we need to change to compete economically. And then she says, if you come to Ireland, say on a Friday, and on a Monday there's a vote of no confidence, and we're out of office, the money, which is almost $1 billion, this is the year 2000, for a country of 4 million people at the time, that money will still be there. We don't flip-flop like you do in the United States. And I took the job as much for that, I told her this, as much for that comment, because it was hard for me to believe that they were really that different in terms of, and they are really that different.
Now we know.
We could learn a few lessons by studying how their government and parliamentary system works compared to what we have now. But that's how it started, and my first day on the job was 9/11. And then we went for 5 years after that.
And just so that if there aren't any Irish scholars, historical scholars in the room, the point of pivot that you're talking about, you probably have all heard of the Celtic Tiger name, and correct me as soon as I say something stupid.
That's highly unlikely.
That 10-year, or roughly 10-year period was based on the idea, the correct idea at the time, that Ireland could have, I think partly through tax legislation, they could bring manufacturing from Dell and Apple and so on, a lot of American Western companies, even European, into a headquarters situation in Ireland, and the result would be much better employment and a real step up in the slightly more abundant economy, and that worked.
That's right. At that time, they had 18 of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies in the world, and every one of the top ICT companies in the world with an operation in Ireland.
Amazing.
Yes.
So what I'm impressed about in this story is that pivot, because somebody, Mary or somebody, realized that here comes China, they don't pay anybody, they're going to beat the pants off of Ireland because you do pay people. So better run fast or do something different.
That's right.
And who figured that out?
Yeah, I had to give a lot of credit to this technology foresight group. Okay, in particular Brian Sweeney, who was a Siemens executive vice president, and Ed Walsh, who's a former president of a university in Ireland.
All right.
They were leading this technology foresight group with a very significant member of the civil service, John Travers. And they did the homework, and they brought I'll say the country together over a year's time.
Amazing.
Get an agreement. And they had a shopping list initially of probably 15 or 20 topics. And they had to narrow it down and focus on a couple of areas. Biotech and ICT, as Pete just mentioned, they were so good in that area. But they worried that these companies were going to move to China or Eastern Europe. If you had nothing to hold them there other than the manufacturing base, they could get lower cost labor in Poland or in China at the time. And that simply concerned them. The government said, we're in for a shock if we don't figure out how to do this, how to connect the universities and the industry with research and get onto the research train that the companies think is important.
Can I add one thing? The power of the Celtic Tiger was not only the economic growth of the 90s, it reversed immigration out of Ireland for the first time in its history.
Amazing.
There were more young people and more people moving to Ireland than were exiting.
Right.
And they knew that if they continued to depend on the manufacturing base, and they were starting to see the numbers, they were starting to see the workers were going elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And let me just, one more
sure.
thing. The thing that was kind of unique, this all happened pretty quickly. My breakfast with Mary was probably April or May, and I was a vice president of research at a university, and I was going to leave, a few months later. It was a very tricky time, had great university support. But they really knew what was happening. They knew they needed to change, and they knew either to build a national laboratory or they needed to do it through the universities. And my argument was, working with the universities, you're going to have constantly a flow of young students getting educated, and you're going to have a workforce for the future, and you're going to build a stronger university. But you have to make it clear that if you're picking the two areas, that you're not asking the whole university, you're asking a couple of areas of science and engineering to focus and help the country advance. And that was a controversial kind of a decision for the government to make. And when I would go around to places, I was seen by some as, an evil person, because I was changing a system that was based upon kind of a uniform allocation to one based upon international competition.
Yeah.
And how we pulled this off is we were trusted. We had accomplished things ourselves. And we brought about 7 people from the US as part of the first team. One was a very distinguished member of the National Academy from Bell Laboratories. We had 2 or 3 people who had either been deans of US universities or directors of research in the National Science Foundation. And then 1 person who had developed the NSF's personnel activities. We brought them, and it helped them, and it helped Ireland develop a new mode of doing work, which they didn't have before. And the universities didn't have overhead before, and we had to introduce that. And so it was like going to a newfound turf, not unlike 1950 in the United States.
Right.
We didn't do research in the United States before end of World War II. Right. I figured I could go there, and with this group of people and with the people that were concerned about the economy, could help them short-circuit some of the things they were trying to do. And we brought a lot of people to the table to help us.
That sounds so much like how Washington works today. It's collegial. Everybody understands the problem together. They reach out across the aisle. They work, solidly for a lot of time, and they have great achievement as a result.
I do want to underscore something, because Bill moved quickly past it, and it was actually quite a dramatic moment. The Irish university system was used to the money from the government basically be given to all parties equally.
Flat, yeah.
Until Bill developed a competitive model that he had helped develop at NSF. The pushback from the Irish Academy was severe.
I bet.
They were public, they were resisting, they would say basically, just give us the money and trust us. And Bill was at the vanguard saying, actually, we're going to do this based on competition.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'd say that influenced my thinking, I was concerned about the US at the time. And I was concerned about the National Science Foundation and other agencies becoming more like a lottery. There were so many people writing proposals and reviewing proposals that were taken away potentially from our innovation in this country. And I thought, if we go over there and see how a country that doesn't have this in place works, maybe there'd be an opportunity to come back and help the states in this country develop a model. Because if we depend on Washington now, I think we're going to have some difficulties in the future in terms of innovation and
I got a feeling that's
fast.
already underway.
But that was what motivated me. I had earlier in my career started the Science and Technology Centers at NSF. And that was very controversial at the time, but it enabled people like Lee Hood and others to do things they could never have done under the individual investigator grant mode. And I worked with Lee in those years and other people who basically saw the need to do bigger and tougher problems, not just a $50,000 individual grant, and how they could work with others and make a difference. And I wanted to take that model to Ireland and see if that could be put in place and if it could make another experiment that you might take back to the States in the future.
I think we need you to try one more time. Amazing. So in doing this, she picked the right guy. You go over there with 7 Americans, or was it what you expected, or was it harder, a lot harder, easier? What was your initial take?
Well, I'm going to let Pete answer that, because Pete and I met. I was at the University of South Carolina as vice president of research and a chemistry professor, and Pete was getting his PhD. And he was about to depart the university when I moved there, and we met and overlapped for a month or so.
Yeah.
Then he's going over to Ireland, I'll call it a sabbatical after the PhD work, and he's in Galway, and I'm invited to talk to them seriously. I fly over to Dublin. Yeah. And I asked him to join me for dinner. Well, I looked at the map, and about 100 miles. And it was about a 3-hour drive.
Yeah.
And so somehow or another, I convinced Pete at that dinner, if I come over here, will you help me for the first few months? We stayed for 3 years, so he could answer some of these questions.
Yeah. I think what I want to underscore is the cultural transformation that Bill and that team helped lead from get your money because you're an Irish academic to earn your money, and just to say, it didn't matter your seniority as a scholar. Junior faculty who had brilliant ideas were winning the grants that SFI had. That's number one. Number two, one of the processes that Bill implemented was that in order to get a grant from SFI, which at the time were the largest grants in the world for research, full stop.
In the world?
In the world. 20 million euro for a 5-year team project, to give you an idea. You had to put in your proposal a support from an industry partner who said this idea interested them. So this was not just research for research.
You're a real rebel, aren't you?
It was about applying it. And the other thing he did, culturally, yes, he brought over this great team from the States, but he also brought in people like John Atkins, a world-renowned biomedical researcher, to oversee the biotech field. He brought in Alistair Glass, who had led a Bell Labs team that developed 5G, to lead the ICT team. So these were respected academics from the EU or from Ireland who gave the American team local credibility.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that's just a few things.
Pretty cool.
Well, it was a unique experience, and when we moved there, we were in the same building and with another organization called IDA. I didn't know what IDA was when I went over there. That became my favorite 3-letter word. They are a remarkable organization that a lot of states here could benefit from by studying them. But Enda Conley came down to meet me and Alistair and started talking to us and established a working relationship and a friendship. And he took me to a couple of places to meet VPs of research. And I remember going to Chicago, and we walked out with a couple of IDA colleagues, and we get to the car, and Enda says, "Bill, I don't know what the hell you're selling in there, but they're buying that research." and they ended up having a lot of research move to Ireland. They now have an IBM research lab and things that wouldn't have happened before. And the universities didn't, the university presidents and deans, they were all for making Ireland stronger. Yeah. So the faculty themselves, some of them were not excited by what we were doing because we were changing things. But by and large, it was a very exciting time.
At the high end, you had support.
It was an exciting time. The junior faculty liked it. They liked the fact that we're encouraging excellence. And we introduced overhead because we didn't want to ruin the good teaching.
Right.
And we wanted to make sure they started buying things differently. They hadn't done that before and weren't used to
By
those
overhead,
things.
you mean take some of the grant money and put it to the
Put
school.
additional money into the grant for overhead to cover if you're going to share computers or get teams to work together the way you're supposed to do in the U.S.
Right.
And they just weren't used to that kind of a thing, and they weren't used to hiring postdocs. There weren't a lot of postdocs at the time. And they were trying to hire everybody like if it was a professor, and you'd send them a year to recruit. Well, we had to guide them in how you can cut that down and decentralize some of that stuff. Yeah. And the universities were ready for it. They had really good presidents who had done research themselves and were very successful. And I think the quality of the universities has only gotten better. They're good universities. They've gotten better over the last 20 years.
So you brought competition to the university system. Yeah. You're getting them to sign up for grants with an industrial partner.
Yes, and they're competing from around the world. So, teams from UNC Chapel Hill or Cambridge or something won these grants and came in.
If they win, do they have to move to Ireland?
Yeah, they had to move, embed themselves in the universities.
We had fellowships to welcome people, and they might come for a year and try it out. Yeah. At that time, non-Irish weren't very common in the university system. Right. Now, that's a very common thing. It's a more open kind of a system. Right. But I had a lot of help. I mean, I had people like Ahmed Zawel from Caltech who would come by and help. Lee came by a couple of times. And we had a good board. We had 4 or 5 people from the U.S. on our board to talk about the culture of competition. We had Anita Jones. We had Eric Block. We had Ira Levin. We had Kira Mazumdar, who runs the biggest biology company in India. She was a great board member. So it was an international board, and there was no, how do I protect the status quo.
Yeah.
We ask, how do you make Ireland more competitive? Ireland wasn't ranked on world rankings back in those days. It might have been with Bangladesh, okay?
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It was just, it wasn't ranked. Now they're one of the most innovative countries in the world, as you mentioned earlier. And you had to give it, and I was only there 5 years. They've been going for 20 years. So there have been a lot of really good people who kept this going. But they really deserve credit, as you mentioned earlier, as a model to study. Yep. And I think our states could study them and benefit as well. Now, a place as big as California, they don't need to study it, but there are a lot of smaller states that could really benefit from that kind of model.
Well, we're going to come right over to that in a minute. Where are we doing? 8 minutes. Okay. Well, pretty soon. Did you begin SFI? So we should stop throwing it. IDA is Ireland Development Authority.
Yeah.
And so they're the industrial development group. You've probably seen them at other conferences. They're all over the place. They're going to be here next year. So when you buy your early bird thing, you'll meet the IDA team, who I talked to yesterday.
That's good.
Isn't that great?
That's good, yeah.
And Mary Harney, by the way, will be here also next year when you buy your, did I mention the early bird thing yet? Okay, so tell us about building SFI, and then let's talk about Arizona.
Well, I think the outline is there. We brought a team in place. We borrowed a lot of ideas from what we had learned in the U.S. and what I'd learned in Europe, studying Europe as well. But I also took into account that there were people out in the U.S. that were like Larry, who you've seen here a number of times, and Lee, who were really facing the battle of how do you fund these big projects. And when I went over there, I wanted to introduce a different model where the scientists had time to do the research, they had longer duration grants, and they had enough money to do things. And what we simply asked them is make sure there's some people in industry who think there's a problem you're working on that they're interested in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to make any kind of application, just I wanted smart people to work together. And that's what our science and technology centers did here. Mm-hmm. They may have been controversial when they started, but they ended up doing really significant things. Everybody wants a center now. They didn't want them back then. They just wanted a grant. Right. So we just took those there, and we had good presidents to work with. We spent a lot of time meeting with people. Yeah. And I think today you have a very, very strong environment in which to do research and to teach. It's a fun place. We got the teachers in the K-12 system in the labs in the summer and gave them laptop computers and made them like a graduate student so they could ask the professor questions. Because often the teachers are put out alone and universities are kind of intimidating. All of you guys in universities think that they're not, but when you get out, it's hard to go back. Mm-hmm. So we put them in the lab, we gave them a laptop, and we had them talking with the faculty members. They could come to their school and ask a biology question. It worked out tremendously, and we had, in the end, a big event, several hundred people in Dublin Castle. And it was a remarkable, the Taoiseach and the taught us to stay there for 3 hours, I think.
Wait. I want to pause on this. So the Dublin Castle is where the power over the Republic of Ireland was passed from Great Britain to Irish government control after the war, the revolution. Mm-hmm. For Irish independence. That is, right, 1917. That is how important Dublin Castle is to the Irish culture. They had never had an event like this at Dublin Castle celebrating science. And the Taoiseach came and stuck around for the entire 3 hours.
That's the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And I kept, every 30 minutes, do you have to leave now? I'll make an excuse. Yeah. This is good. At the end, we had 2 teachers speak. And they brought the entire audience. They just couldn't believe what was happening in the whole school system because the universities had connected with them. Nice. And the industry was there to say how much they appreciated the universities connecting with them. And when I went there, Intel, which was a big entity there, it was the first place Intel had moved out of the United States. And they were successful, and other people moved there because of that workforce. Well, I went over there my first week. I went to see the Intel's managing director. And he says, Bill, we're going to help you all we can, but we don't really want this. This is not a good idea. The universities aren't going to work with us or help us, but we'll want you to visit periodically. And when I left, they gave me a big wafer to hang on my wall to show Craig Barrett, the former CEO, the difference that SFI made in a short period of time to places like Intel and the bio companies.
That was the other thing. So there was a lot of nervousness for about €1 billion at a small country for this kind of investment. But the results began happening so quickly. So I was in charge of communications and media. Right. The story we had to tell within 2 to 3 years of the caliber of researchers that were coming or the types of ideas that were getting funded were drawing the attention of journals like Science and Nature and places all around the world who were propelling this story, which only perpetuated greater interest from scholars like those.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's change channels here for a minute, because part of that book is when the Buddingers reached out to you, I believe, and said, the heck with this whole Irish thing, we need help over here in Arizona. And you came to Arizona, if I'm saying this correctly, and you did something similar in Arizona, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
We have 341. Tell us the story.
Yeah, the idea was, can we replicate this model? Can we learn from this model and take it and adapt it? Not replicate it, but adapt it to the local environment. And we started out with this different financial model, but a very interesting model. And it worked for several years. Governor Napolitano was the person behind it. She was like Mary Harney. And when she left to be a Homeland Security Secretary, there was an election, and a bunch of young legislators came into their house. And single-handedly, they basically wanted to cut anything the Democrat governor had in place. And we were cut arbitrarily like that, even though the money had been put in reserve.
So to be clear, at that time, Arizona was a Republican state with a Democratic governor, was very popular.
Yeah.
And somebody who made a huge mistake decided she'd be better off in D.C., and all hell broke loose.
And
there was money
there
pulled.
was an election, okay?
Yeah.
And she was leaving, and it coincided with
Right.
the election by
Right.
a couple of months. And it wasn't anything that's a surprise now what we see in the country, but that was the first kind of evidence of the Tea Party kind of thing and pushing for certain things. You have an R or a D and you're the enemy.
Yeah.
And that's not how it was before in Arizona.
Right.
And it's not how Washington was before. But
Right.
we saw that early on and lived with it. And it concerns me now that we don't have the honest debates and discussion that I saw in Ireland. And I would say that the discussions we have in here, if we could replace this audience with some people in D.C. and we might have a more civil society.
We could secede right here and keep going.
But that's the issue. So Arizona did a lot of things differently. There was more money in the U.S. for funding research at the time. And so I knew, because of what I argue is the lottery almost at NIH and NSF now, there's so many good proposals. We were told that when we got there that we had to spend the money by June, which we didn't have to do in Ireland. Had to spend it in a certain period of time, you'd lose it. Well, this was January when I was told that. And so we had to figure out what to do, and what we did is introduce something called Competitive Advantage Awards, where we put a group of people together, of some of the likes you have in this room, and we had the universities send us their best 15 or 20 NIH proposals. We focused on biology, I think, and the ones that barely missed getting funded. And we had a review of those, and we picked the ones that we could afford. We put about $8 million into something like that. The state got about almost a 64 or 70 million return. The people wrote new proposals with more data and were successful. And there are things like that you could do in different states to help different states, because they've all got different strengths. And we have a one-size-fits-all model now where the young faculty in particular are really struggling if they don't get that first grant. The states ought to make some investment. The states ought to be thinking about a science advisor and how to make the states more flexible and more competitive, to make their states attractive to business, the way Ireland made its country more attractive so the companies didn't go to Eastern Europe or China.
Right.
It was a determined decision by the government to be proactive and make a difference.
And stick to it when even the Great Recession that hit the world devastated Ireland more than almost any developed nation. They didn't subtract any funding for the entire. They kept.
There's no votes in science or research. The Irish government was really impressive.
Well, I know from the help you've given me to get over there, which I did recently, how much they think of you both, and what you've achieved for them. They'll never be able to thank you enough. But I'm proud you're here, and I think we're all proud to know you and that you were able to do this. So at some future time, when America returns to sanity, just after the next 10 wars or something, we'll be able to have conversations together like we do here, and we'll have learned from you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.